The September rain drummed against the stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Cathedral as I sat in the back pew, wearing the only black dress I owned. It wasn't designer like my cousin Elena's Versace or my Aunt Carol's Chanel, but it was clean and respectful. That's all Dad would have cared about anyway. The cathedral was packed. Dad had touched so many lives during his 40 years as a high school principal, but the family section told a different story. They'd claimed the first 3 rows like a fortress, leaving me isolated in the back with the teachers and former students who actually knew who my father really was. I'm Maria Torres, though my family had spent the last 8 years pretending I didn't exist. At 31, I was the daughter who'd thrown her life away by leaving my corporate job to start my own business. The one who'd embarrassed them by moving into a modest apartment and driving a 10-year-old Honda instead of leasing something impressive. The family disappointment who'd chosen substance over appearances. They only knew. Aunt Carol turned in the front pew, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the disdain in her eyes as she spotted me. She whispered something to my Uncle Roberto, who glanced back with the same expression of barely concealed disgust. My cousin Elena didn't even bother looking. She was too busy checking her phone, probably updating her social media about attending such a meaningful service. The priest's voice echoed through the cathedral as he spoke about Dad's dedication to education, his love for his students, his commitment to helping underprivileged kids find their path. Everything the family had rolled their eyes at during Sunday dinners, calling it throwing good money after bad causes. I touched the small silver cross at my throat, the one Dad had given me for my confirmation. The one piece of jewelry I never took off even though it wasn't worth more than $50. Unlike the diamond tennis bracelet Elena was wearing, it had actual meaning. As the service progressed, I found myself remembering the last conversation I'd had with Dad, just 2 weeks before his sudden heart attack. We'd met at his favorite diner, the one where he'd taken me for pancakes every Saturday morning when I was little. "I'm proud of you, Mija," he'd said, stirring sugar into his coffee with hands that had graded thousands of papers over the decades. "You're doing something real, something that matters." The family hadn't understood why I'd walked away from my 6-figure job at Morrison & Associates to start Torres Solutions, a consulting firm that helped small businesses navigate technology transitions. They saw it as throwing away success. Dad saw it as building something meaningful. "Your mother would be proud too," he'd added, his voice soft. Mom had died when I was 16, and Dad had raised me alone while teaching full-time and earning his master's degree at night. The family had considered his struggle beneath them even then. Now watching them perform their grief for the packed cathedral, I felt that familiar mixture of sadness and anger. They'd barely visited Dad in his final years, too busy with their country club memberships and charity galas to spend time with a public school principal who lived in a modest house and drove a 12-year-old Camry. The priest concluded his remarks and invited family members to share memories. Uncle Roberto stood first, adjusting his expensive suit as he walked to the podium. His voice boomed through the sound system as he painted a picture of his beloved brother that bore little resemblance to the man who'd actually raised me. "Eduardo was a pillar of our community," Roberto declared, his politician's smile gleaming under the cathedral lights. "A man who understood the importance of family values and financial responsibility." I had to bite my tongue. This was the same man who'd told Dad that teaching was a waste of his potential, and that he should have gone into real estate like the rest of the Torres men. Elena spoke next, her voice trembling with what I assumed was practiced emotion. She talked about Uncle Eduardo's wisdom, and how he'd always encouraged the family to pursue excellence. The same uncle she'd complained about to anyone who'd listen, calling his house embarrassingly small, and his car a piece of junk. Finally, Aunt Carol approached the podium. At 58 she was the family matriarch, the one who'd taken it upon herself to maintain the Torres image after Dad's wife, my mother, had died. She'd never forgiven him for not remarrying someone from their social circle, and she'd never forgiven me for existing as a reminder of his poor choices. "My brother Eduardo was a good man," she began, her voice carrying that particular blend of condescension and false sentiment she'd perfected over the years. "But he was also stubborn. He had ideas about success that didn't always align with reality." I shifted uncomfortably in my pew. Even at Dad's funeral she couldn't resist taking shots at his choices. "He believed in helping others, sometimes to his own detriment," Carol continued. He gave and gave even when it meant sacrificing his own financial security. It's a cautionary tale about the importance of practical decision-making. The coded message was clear. Dad had been a fool for choosing teaching over money, for helping students instead of building wealth, for raising a daughter who'd followed in his impractical footsteps. As she returned to her seat, I felt the familiar burn of rage in my chest. 8 years of family dinners where they dismissed my business as playing with computers. 8 years of Christmas gatherings where they'd asked when I was going to get serious about my career. 8 years of watching them treat Dad like a well-meaning failure while living off trust funds their grandfather had built through actual hard work. The service concluded with a final prayer, and the family began filing out for the reception at the country club. I hung back, letting them pass without acknowledgement. I wasn't invited to the reception anyway. Aunt Carol had made that clear when she'd called to inform me about the funeral arrangements. "We thought it would be best to keep things simple," she'd said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "You understand how these things can be complicated with family dynamics." What she'd meant was that my presence would be embarrassing. The family failure mingling with their important friends, reminding everyone that Eduardo Torres had raised a daughter who'd chosen substance over status. I was gathering my purse when the funeral director approached. Thomas Mackenzie had been handling services at St. Matthew's for 30 years, and his expression was carefully professional as he walked down the aisle toward me. "Excuse me," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "Are you Maria Torres?" I nodded, wondering if there was some paperwork issue with Dad's arrangements. "I wanted to speak with you privately," he continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "About the funeral expenses." My heart sank. Had Dad left unpaid bills? Was I going to have to scramble to cover costs I couldn't afford? The business was doing well, but I still lived modestly, reinvesting most of my profits back into growth. "There's been some confusion," Mackenzie said, pulling out a folder. "Your family seems to believe they're responsible for the costs, but our records show that everything was prepaid by you 3 months ago. The entire service, the flowers, even the reception at the country club." I stared at him, my mind racing. 3 months ago, I'd gotten a call from Dad's doctor about his heart condition. The prognosis had been serious but not immediately life-threatening. I'd made some calls, taken care of some arrangements, but I'd done it quietly. Dad would have been furious if he'd known. "The amount was quite substantial," Mackenzie continued. "The full cathedral service, premium arrangements, catering for 200 people. Nearly $40,000 in total." Before I could respond, I heard the sharp click of expensive heels on marble. Aunt Carol was walking back up the aisle, her face twisted with the particular expression she reserved for dealing with unpleasant necessities. "Maria," she said, her voice barely concealing her irritation, "you need to move along. We have a reception to attend and this isn't the place for lingering." She glanced at Mackenzie with the dismissive look she used for service workers. "Thomas, thank you for everything. The family will settle the final expenses this week." Mackenzie looked between us, clearly uncomfortable. "Actually, Mrs. Rodriguez, that's what I was just explaining to Ms. Torres. The expenses have already been covered." Carol's perfectly arched eyebrows drew together. "Covered by whom?" "We haven't sent payment yet." "By your niece," Mackenzie said simply. "Miss Torres prepaid everything 3 months ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Carol's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked like panic. "That's impossible," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Maria doesn't have that kind of money. She works with computers or something." I felt the familiar sting of her dismissal, but this time it was followed by something else. A calm, cold satisfaction that I'd been building toward for 8 years. "Actually," Mackenzie said, consulting his folder, "Miss Torres owns Torres Solutions, which handled our cathedral's complete technology overhaul last year. She also funded the scholarship program that's helped over 300 students attend college." Carol's face was going pale under her foundation. "Scholarship program?" "The Eduardo Torres Memorial Scholarship," Mackenzie continued, clearly not understanding the family dynamics at play. "Though it wasn't memorial when it was established. Miss Torres set it up to honor her father while he was still alive. $500,000 endowment, renewable annually." The folder slipped from Carol's manicured fingers, scattering papers across the marble floor. I watched her scramble to pick them up, her designer dress not designed for such practical movements. $500,000, she whispered. I looked at Mackenzie, then at my aunt's shocked face and made a decision. 8 years of being treated like a failure. 8 years of watching them dismiss Dad's choices and mine. 8 years of quiet condescension and barely concealed contempt. Actually, I said, my voice steady and clear, the scholarship is just one of several programs Torres Solutions funds. We also support the technology initiatives at 5 local schools, the Small Business Development Center downtown, and the community college's coding boot camp. Carol struggled to her feet, papers clutched in her trembling hands. How much money are we talking about? Mackenzie looked confused by the question, but I decided to answer it directly. Torres Solutions generated $12 million in revenue last year, I said simply. We're expanding into 3 new markets next quarter. The sound Carol made was somewhere between a gasp and a choke. She stared at me like I'd suddenly sprouted wings. 12 million, she repeated weakly. In revenue, I clarified. Net profit was about 30% of that, though most of it gets reinvested in community programs or business expansion. Mackenzie was looking between us with growing understanding. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private? But Carol was still staring at me, her brain clearly struggling to process this information. But you live in that tiny apartment. You drive that old car. I live below my means, I said simply. It's something Dad taught me. The difference between having money and spending money. She sank down onto a nearby pew, her legs apparently unable to support her anymore. But you never said anything. All these years you let us think. Let you think what? I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. That I was a failure? That I'd thrown my life away? That Dad's values were worthless. The cathedral fell silent except for the continued drumming of rain against the windows. Mackenzie excused himself quietly, leaving us alone in the vast space. Your father, Carol began, then stopped. He knew. Of course he knew. He helped me write the business plan. He was my first investor, actually. Loaned me $5,000 from his savings to get started. Carol's eyes were wide with something between shock and horror. $5,000? Which I paid back with interest within 6 months, I continued. Along with a 10% stake in the company which he held until he died. His shares are worth about $800,000 now. She made that choking sound again. $800,000? The lawyers are still working out the details, but Dad's will specifies that his stake should be used to expand the scholarship program. By the time everything's finalized, it'll be enough to send about 40 kids to college every year. Carol stared at me for a long moment, her perfect composure completely shattered. All this time, she whispered. All this time you were successful, I supplied. Yeah. Just not the kind of success you recognize. I stood up, smoothing my simple black dress. I should probably get going. I have a board meeting tomorrow morning with the city council about a new education initiative. Carol grabbed my arm as I passed her pew. Maria, wait. The reception. You should come. The family will want to. Want to what? I asked, gently removing her hand from my arm. Suddenly pretend you've been proud of me all along? Act like you didn't spend 8 years treating me like an embarrassment. She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. I'm not angry, Aunt Carol. Not anymore. But I'm also not interested in playing family politics at Dad's funeral reception. I started walking toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty cathedral. Maria, she called after me. Please. We didn't know. I paused at the cathedral entrance, turning back to look at her. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the revelation that everything she'd believed about success and failure had been wrong. You didn't know because you didn't want to know, I said quietly. You were so busy judging Dad's choices and mine that you never bothered to ask what we were actually building. The rain had stopped by the time I reached my Honda in the parking lot. As I unlocked the door, I saw the family emerging from the cathedral's side entrance. Elena was gesticulating wildly, clearly excited about something. Roberto had his phone pressed to his ear, probably already working his connections to figure out how much I was really worth. And Carol walked slowly behind them, still looking dazed. I drove home through the quiet streets, past the coffee shop where Dad and I had our last conversation, past the high school where he'd spent 40 years shaping young minds, past the small house where he'd raised me alone after Mom died. My apartment was indeed tiny by the family's standards. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen and living area. But it was mine, bought and paid for, with no mortgage weighing me down. The rent from the other units in the building I owned covered all my personal expenses, leaving my business income free for reinvestment and community programs. I changed out of my funeral dress and into comfortable jeans and a sweater. Dad had never cared about designer clothes or expensive cars. He'd cared about education, about helping people, about building something meaningful. Values he'd passed on to me even when the rest of the family thought they were naive. My laptop chimed with an email notification. 3 new client inquiries, 2 from local businesses and 1 from a school district 3 states away that had heard about our education technology initiatives. Torres Solutions had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd first left my corporate job, but it had grown in exactly the direction Dad and I had planned. Another email caught my attention. The subject line read, "Maria from Elena." I hesitated before opening it. Elena had barely spoken to me in years, and when she did, it was usually to make some comment about my lifestyle choices. "Maria," the email began, "I can't stop thinking about what happened at the cathedral today. I had no idea about your business or the scholarship program. Roberto is furious that none of us knew, and Aunt Carol has been crying for 2 hours. I think we need to talk. Could we have coffee this week? I feel like there's a lot I don't understand about our family." I stared at the message for a long moment. 8 years of condescension and dismissal, and now they wanted to talk. Now that they knew I was successful by their standards, suddenly my perspective mattered. But as I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by the life I'd built according to Dad's values rather than their expectations, I realized something important. I didn't need their validation anymore. I'd stopped needing it the day I'd chosen to build something meaningful instead of something impressive. My phone buzzed with a text message from Mackenzie. "Miss Torres, I wanted you to know that several people from the service have asked about making donations to the scholarship program. Your father touched many lives and they'd like to honor his memory. Would you be available to discuss this tomorrow?" I smiled, typing back my response. Absolutely. Dad would have loved that. Then I opened my laptop and began working on a proposal for the city council meeting. A new initiative to bring coding education to elementary schools across the district. Something that would help hundreds of kids learn skills they'd need for the future. Something Dad would have been proud of. Outside my window, the rain had started again, but my small apartment felt warm and purposeful. I had work to do, programs to build, students to help. The family could have their country club reception and their expensive clothes and their social climbing. I had something better. I had Dad's legacy and I was building on it every day. 3 months later, I was sitting in the same cathedral, but this time for a much happier occasion. The Torres Solutions Foundation was hosting an awards ceremony for the recipients of the Eduardo Torres Memorial Scholarship. 23 students were receiving full college scholarships, funded by the program that had grown from Dad's initial investment and my company's success. The cathedral was packed again, but this time with students, teachers, parents, and community members. People who understood that real success wasn't measured in designer clothes or expensive cars, but in the lives you touched and the futures you helped create. I stood at the podium where Aunt Carol had delivered her condescending eulogy just months before, looking out at faces filled with hope and gratitude. My father, Eduardo Torres, believed that education was the great equalizer. I began, my voice steady and clear. He believed that every child deserved a chance to reach their potential, regardless of their family's financial situation. In the audience, I spotted familiar faces. Mackenzie sat in the 3rd row, having become a friend and supporter of the foundation. Several of Dad's former colleagues were there, along with dozens of students he'd taught over the years. And in the back, almost hidden behind a pillar, I saw Aunt Carol. She'd been calling regularly since the funeral, trying to rebuild our relationship. I wasn't ready for that yet, but I wasn't angry anymore either. She was learning slowly that there were different ways to measure success. These scholarship recipients represent the best of what my father believed in, I continued. They're students who've overcome obstacles, who've worked hard, who've shown that determination and character matter more than privilege. The ceremony continued with each student receiving their award and sharing their plans for college. A future teacher, an aspiring engineer, a student who wanted to study social work to help other kids from difficult backgrounds. every one of them embodying the values Dad had lived by. As the event concluded and people began to mingle, Elena approached me. She'd been different since the funeral, less focused on appearances and more interested in substance. She'd even started volunteering with one of the community programs Torres Solutions supported. "Maria," she said, "I wanted to thank you again for including me in the foundation work. It's been enlightening." I smiled, remembering the family dynamics that had once seemed so important. Dad always said the best education happens outside the classroom. He nodded, looking thoughtful. I'm starting to understand what he meant. Later that evening, as I locked up the cathedral and prepared to head home, Mackenzie joined me on the front steps. "Another successful event," he said, looking satisfied. "Your father would be proud." I looked up at the stained glass windows that had witnessed both Dad's funeral and tonight's celebration. I think he would be. Though he'd probably remind me that the real measure of success isn't the ceremony, it's what happens next. Mackenzie chuckled. Spoken like Eduardo's daughter. As I drove home through the familiar streets, I passed the high school where Dad had worked, the coffee shop where we'd had our last conversation, the modest house where he'd taught me that success wasn't about what others thought of you, but about what you built for others. My phone buzzed with a message from one of tonight's scholarship recipients. "Ms. Torres, thank you for believing in me. I promised to make Mr. Torres proud." I smiled, thinking about Dad's reaction to tonight's ceremony. He would have been proud, not because his daughter had become wealthy, but because she'd learned to use that wealth the way he'd used his modest teacher's salary, to open doors for others. The family had finally learned to respect my success, but that wasn't what mattered anymore. What mattered was the 23 students who now had a chance at college, the hundreds more who would benefit from our technology programs, and the community of people who understood that real wealth isn't what you accumulate but what you give away. I pulled into my parking space behind the small apartment building I owned, thinking about tomorrow's schedule. A meeting with the school board about expanding our coding program, a consultation with a small business that needed help with their technology transition, and a video call with a college in California that wanted to replicate our scholarship model. Dad had been right about success. It wasn't about impressing your family or meeting their expectations. It was about building something meaningful, something that would outlast you, something that would make the world a little bit better. And as I climbed the stairs to my modest apartment, I knew that by his standards, I'd succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Not because I'd proven the family wrong, but because I'd proven him right. The best revenge wasn't showing them I was wealthy. It was showing them that their definition of success had been wrong all along.